right, so I think we're good to go. Welcome everyone. I am Professor Alva Taylor. I'm a professor in the strategy department and I am the faculty director of the Center for Digital Strategies. I am really happy to talk to our visitor today, Niraj Shah, who's the CEO of Wayfair. I'm not going to go too much in your background other than the fact that that you're a fellow Cornell grad. I will say that, undergrad. The great thing about, what's really interesting about thinking about you and Wayfair is for many people, it's just recently on their radar, given the great success you've had recently. I think it has a crazy market, I shouldn't say crazy, a very nice market cap of almost 30 billion, 29 billion. The stock has risen from earlier this year, late 20s to over 300. But I think the thing that would surprise most people, Niraj, is that the company's been around for 18 years. So it's not, while a lot of people often craft it as sort of this startup, this brand new startup in the space, it's been around for a long time. So just to get us started, give us a little bit of a sense of, in starting Wayfair, what are the principles that you and your co-founder, Steve Conan, so what are the principles that guided the founding, and how do you view the company and the company's sort of value proposition, if put it in terms that many of our students will understand?
Sure. So, you know, when we started the company 18 years ago, at the time, the company name was CSN Stores, and the opportunity that we had identified was that while e-commerce was kind of operating in a whole bunch of categories by national folks, so whether it's books, electronics, and the like, there were a lot of niche categories that were actually doing well online, but it was all mom and pop type operations. And so when you started looking at sort of the ways you could grow an e-commerce business through excellent service and through logistics and through quantitative marketing, the smaller operators generally weren't able to take advantage of those types of opportunities. And the larger companies were focused on other categories. So we decided there's an opportunity for us to focus on these narrow categories. And we thought we could build a big e-commerce business by doing that. What ended up happening is one of our very first category, TV stands and speaker stands, basically took off right away. We then learned from our suppliers that all of their furniture categories were doing well online. Whereas we thought, well, TV stands was more of a niche, but, you know, bedroom furniture wouldn't do well because there was, you know, large furniture players in every geography. And so what ended up happening is we went through furniture over 3 years, every subcategory one at a time, and then decor, and then housewares and home improvement. And we effectively built a great home offering, broad home offering, but no one knew who we were. So the reason our story has like two halves. There's the sort of CSN Stores decade, so 2002 to 2011. And by 2008, 2009, we had realized that the real big opportunity would be to be the branded destination for all things home. And so we hadn't raised any money. And so for the first time we raised money in 2011, we'd gotten to about 500 million in sales, and we'd bootstrapped our way there. So we owned the entire company, but we didn't have the cash flow we thought we would need to build a consumer brand. So we raised some money. In 2011, we launched Wayfair as a brand. And it took us a couple of years to kind of get it working well. And so then by 2013, we started marketing it. And I would say by 2017 or so, we'd reached, you know, what I would consider at least to be household brand status in the United States. And we now have that in Canada. We have that in the UK as well. And so I think to a lot of folks, Wayfair is a relatively new brand, but, you know, the journey has multiple parts, you know, and I think that's kind of the kind of key thing to understand. Joe, I'm trying to remember, there's a second part to your question, and I didn't.
So as you think about the start, are there any sort of core principles that you and Steve had that still sort of exist today in the company that's helped contribute to your success?
Yeah, you know, what's interesting, one of the things we put significant effort in is actually to maintain the culture, and we think it's the same culture we've had from the very beginning. And as we get bigger, it's harder to maintain it, but it's almost a more critical. And so the culture, I think of it as, we're very focused on the customer. We're very comfortable taking risks. We don't expect everything to work out, but you learn through the things that don't work out, and the things that do work out, you get the benefits from. We believe in data, so we're all highly quantitative, and so we really we sort of expect all the operators in the company to be very facile with using data, to be instinctual about wanting to use data, to always think about how data can guide them. And we have this kind of like highly collaborative, highly ambitious type environment. So we want people who are highly collaborative and highly ambitious, and we think that kind of that culture underpins our ability to succeed. And so we basically we talk a lot about that culture when we have our people principles are part of, we're actually now integrating it into the performance review process. So it's actually part of how we basically evaluate people. It's already part of how when we do recruiting, how we look, who are we looking for? And we try to make it very clear what our culture is so that we can attract the folks who are drawn to that type of culture. And if it's not the right culture for someone, it doesn't mean that they're good or bad, but Wayfair is probably not the right place for them.
Yeah. It's interesting. You talked about building a culture, and it seems like you were patient in building the company. Were the investors as impatient? I mean, they're really happy now, but through the journey, were they as patient with the growth of the company?
I think, well, the answer is yes, but to keep in mind, from 2002 to 2011, there were no investors, right? So the first decade, there's basically no investors. Then the investors who came in 2011, the first couple of years they were involved would be more challenging as well. We were getting Wayfair up and running, and we weren't necessarily growing great in those years, but they invested off that sort of thesis that building a brand would unlock a huge opportunity. And so they sort of knew that they were investing into, while we had 500 million sales, we were changing the business model. And so they sort of knew, eyes wide open, that, hey, there's a risk in this, but if you believe in the opportunity, it's quite a big opportunity, right?
So you talked about sort of changing the business model. So you were one of the early digitally native companies that actually shipped and were dealing with physical products. And in your case, big, bulky physical products in many cases. Can you talk to us about the specific challenges of being in that space and how those challenges have changed over the last sort of 5 years or so in order to meet the demands, both the competitive demands and the customer demands there?
Yeah, so we've always focused on logistics, and really that's for a few reasons. So one is, first of all, logistics is a pretty big piece of the cost structure. So between what our suppliers spend and what we spend on logistics, it's about 20 cents of every revenue dollar. So obviously optimizing that is very important. Second is the items we sell, not only are they big and bulky, but they're also prone to damage. And so if you think about the logistics journey, making it easy and convenient for a customer, avoiding damage and offering fast delivery is a complicated undertaking. And so only by focusing on it and optimizing it can you really tackle that. And so I would say one of the things that's changed that's been really exciting. In the early days, we recognized the complexity of logistics, but we were far too small to directly affect it. So we could only do that by picking the appropriate third parties we thought were the best, trying to work with them as much as possible, but with more limited ability to affect the outcome. Then starting in 2015, we'd reached a scale where we felt like we could start to operate proprietary logistics. And so that's warehouses, it's transportation depots and delivery operations. And we now have we're a freight forwarder as well. We're a non-vessel ocean operating carrier. We have Asian consolidation operations. And so at this point, we have 18 million square feet. We have 7,000 or 8,000 people who work in these operations. For the large items that get delivered into your home, the two-person deliveries, those we do about 75% of the United States ones and 45% of the Canadian ones with our own delivery operations without using third parties. And each piece of taking it over has led to basically customer convenience in addition to improvements in quality, in addition to reductions in cost. And so that kind of trifecta, there's very few things where you can get that trifecta where you can take costs down while making it better. And so that's why we put so much energy into logistics.
And so as you talk about the importance of logistics, as you look forward, especially around sort of changes in the industry, what do you see? What's the next big thing? Is there a point of emphasis or an area that you're going to emphasize going forward that you haven't put as much emphasis? For example, greater selection or customization of product. What's sort of the next big focus for Wayfair?
So one of the things that I often comment about when you talk about e-commerce and, basically e-commerce involving physical goods, it's it's a very challenging business model. And the reason it's challenging is that it's not about merchandising. It's not about marketing. It's not about customer service. It's not around delivery and logistics. It's not about selection. It's not about the imagery. It ends up being about all of it, meaning that any one of those being weak can kill you, but no one of those being strong can save you. So you end up having to build sort of the well-rounded athlete, whereas there's certain business models, not to say that they're easier, but if we were a pharmaceutical company and we were great at discovering amazing drugs, we could be average at marketing or average at sales and distribution, and you would be fine because that one thing you were great at, that alone can make your whole business. And e-commerce does not lend itself to that one thing. And so we've kind of from the early days sort of recognized that. And as a result, we've sort of tried not to have a culture that's all oriented around the best merchants and sort of everyone else in the company focuses on supporting the merchants, but rather the what we think is an honest view that you actually need to be the well-rounded athlete. And that approach, I think, has served us well because we also view that each area can unlock a competitive advantage. And the way you win in e-commerce is the aggregate moat you build. No one thing kind of counts up the whole moat. And so you're just trying to have each group contribute a little bit to that moat.
Now, you're one of and I'm sure you get people inquiring about this all the time, because you're one of the companies that are pointed as has successfully competed against Amazon, right? So Amazon's the Death Star out there. What's your secret, or for a company that was starting or growing and was worried about Amazon competition, what would be your words of wisdom, or what's your secret why Wayfair has been successful and been able to grow even with Amazon providing much of the same products that you provide, or the same type of product?
Well, I think the truth is not everything is the same as each other. So in other words, Amazon gets broadly thought of as winning in everything in e-commerce. And part of that is because there's very big chunks of e-commerce. If you think about basically in physical goods, non-auto, I should caveat it with, 60% are basically broadly what you think of as general merchandise, whether that's a 12-pack of legal pads, or whether that's dish soap, or whether that is, paper towels, or a 42-inch flat screen TV. They're branded goods. Most of them are bought on a consumable replenishment type basis. It's very easy to compare the items. And frankly, while you have a brand preference, like, so in paper towels, I tend to buy Bounty. The truth is, whether I buy Bounty or Brawny or 7th Generation, they're largely the same item. At the end of the day, they're largely the same item. And you're not going to be, there's only so much research one will put in, because at the end of the day, you're either price driven or brand loyal. And frankly, it doesn't matter which one you buy, because they're effectively the same product. That's 60% of the total dollar volume of physical goods in retail. 20% is grocery. Grocery has the lowest margin but the highest frequency. And so you can buy, everyone buys it once or twice a week. So most large retailers focus on those two tranches, and the 10% that's home and the 10% that's fashion, those are interesting because they're higher margin, but they're super different. And so what happens is, Target and Walmart built the super centers in the 80s to add grocery to get the frequency. They have a little home section and they have an apparel section, but they know they're not the best at it, but they just try to pull through what volume they can because it just averages up their margin. But the core of what they are is that 60 and that 20. Amazon started with that 60, and with Fresh and Whole Foods and different efforts, they've gone after the 20, the grocery, pretty aggressively for the same reason. They want the frequency. They want to be your destination, and you'll pull through the 60 when you do that. Now, they similarly, have fashion and home, but they aren't optimized for that. And it's very hard to optimize for fashion and home when your core business is the 60 and the 20. And obviously 80 is bigger than 10 and 10, right?
Right.
And so as a result, they sell the commodity versions of fashion and home. But as soon as someone's really shopping for clothing or really shopping for home, the product discovery experience, the content, the imagery, the quality of the delivery, the convenience, these things matter tremendously. And Amazon's just not in a position to offer that. And it doesn't make sense for them to prioritize it above the other things they're going after, because frankly, in their business, the other things they're going after are more valuable to them, right? And so you find leaders like in Europe in fashion, you have Zalando, you have ASOS, globally for luxury, you have Farfetch. We're focused, we're the leader in home in both Europe and North America. Auto is its own category, and you have Carvana and Vroom, and you have others that are basically leaders in auto. And you just find that each of those three things are kind of their own animals. And they don't necessarily, like we wouldn't automatically be great at selling commodity goods or selling grocery. Like we're not set up for that. And so that's what creates, that difference creates a really big opportunity. And what we do is we keep doubling down by staying only focused on home. So even though we have 3,200 people writing software and building software to run our business, and with 200 data scientists, and we have 3,000 people in customer service, and we have 8,000 people in logistics, and we have 400 people in marketing. Even though we have these large teams, what we don't do is get distracted with other opportunities. We stay focused on home, so we keep adding nuance into how we approach it. And for the customer, that makes Wayfair feel like a bespoke destination for a category they care a lot about. And similarly, Zalando or others for fashion. And at the same time, that's not inconsistent with you being a very loyal Amazon customer and going to Amazon all the time for all your core needs, where they're very strong.
And I mean, that's interesting that you haven't been distracted. And so have there been situations where you've thought seriously about going into auto or going into other spaces, and you've decided to stick with your core, or that's always been the focus and you've never wavered?
Before we launched Wayfair, we had different websites for each product category. We ended up with about 250 of them. In those days, there were some categories that we had kind of wandered our way into that weren't consistent. For example, we sold kayaks and paddleboards, canoes. And so when we decided to launch Wayfair as a brand, we basically came up with a definition of what we thought made sense for us to be in home. And we ended up closing some categories. Like we had a website selling shoes, and we decided that didn't make sense. If you want to build a brand, it doesn't make sense to dabble. You really need to say, well, this is what we do, and we're going to be the best at what we do, and we're going to put our full energy into everything we're doing. And because dabbling, you end up losing in any commerce. Or internet, basically, it's very unforgiving. Like if you end up in third place, you end up in last place. You end up going out of business. And so generally the number one company is either the only one or the dominant share owner. And so in certain things like search, Google has 92% share in the Western world, and Bing basically has, 8% share. E-commerce is not quite as concentrated, but significantly concentrated. And so we thought there's a really big opportunity. The other reason is, frankly, if you look at B2B and B2C of just the categories we're in home, it's $400 billion in North America, it's $400 billion in Europe. And so $800 billion, even at $14 billion, we really don't have very much share. So there's just such a road of opportunity ahead of us. We didn't, just imagine if you can end up being a 20, 30, 40% share owner over time. You're talking about a business that would be hundreds of billions in revenue. And that's a realistic possibility if you look at how share gets concentrated online. But it requires, maniacal execution. You really need to be the best, because it's easy for customers to figure out if you're the best. And if you're not, they're going to go wherever serves them the best, right?
Right. Yeah, and as I think about that, one of the things so as the country's facing COVID, my guess is your focus has actually helped you. And as you've gone through the COVID, as the country's going through this COVID times, in some ways that's put a higher focus on Wayfair because people are at home. People see that they want to improve their home decor. And so you can see how that could be a help to Wayfair. My guess is there were some challenges in this as well, in meeting the ramp up of need, the ramp up of volume, et cetera. What were the challenges that Wayfair faced over the last sort of 6 to 9 months with COVID? And sort of what are the lessons you've learned in going through this?
Yeah, so what was interesting, we were able to very quickly get our customer service folks working from home, all our corporate staff folks working from home, and put in place the safety protocols that allowed our 65 different logistics operations to all keep running. And And that was really kind of a heroic feat of the team we have. And so it was really, you watch the team and there's so much uncertainty and things are continually changing. The regulations were constantly changing. This is at the very beginning, the first number of weeks. And there's a huge amount of unknowns. And you start to realize all the effort you put in to amass and build a great team, it pays off. Generally in life, it pays off, all the time, but you see how it really pays off in times of acute crisis. And at that point, frankly, you're going to do it with whatever team you have. So it's too late to change your team, right? So in other words, you need to be prepared, even though you don't know what you've prepared yourself for. I think that was a big thing. What we've also seen is COVID. It's just, it's interesting when you look at the history, pandemics, they're really not that uncommon, right? Most people encounter one in their lifetime, but yet before this year, I wouldn't have realized that. Now perhaps I'm not a good student of history. Maybe I should have known that, but I think most folks didn't really kind of internalize that map, but everyone now talks, has learned a lot about the Spanish flu, which was basically 100 years ago, and the effect that had, which was dramatic, right? And so I think what we realized is that one of the behaviors that changed is e-commerce has a lot of value for folks, but it's relatively new. And what was interesting is just seeing how customers who were loath to buy grocery online or loath to buy home goods online were now willing to give it a shot. And I think that's going to be one of the things coming out of this that's just dramatic, which is that our online penetration in our categories was ticking up each year, but I think it's just gone through kind of a massive surge. And it's kind of a one-way door, which is when customers finally experience what the online proposition is and the selection available and the convenience of delivery, it's not that they won't go to stores ever again, but the amount of shopping they shift online is meaningful, and then they continue to shift more and more online each year.
I mean, that's one of the interesting things. So if you've had this ramp up of volume, I'm sure that puts some pressures on your supply chain, particularly given the obstacles that arisen because of COVID in the supply chain. How did you manage the supply chain issues that placed upon you? Because you had this dual thing of broken supply chains but increased volume. How did Wayfair handle that?
I mean, you're effectively just trying to keep everything going. So you're trying to secure the capacity you need. We did a lot of work, not just understanding the regulations and understanding what there was to do and how to do it, but then sharing that information with our 10,000 plus suppliers so that they could then take advantage of the information, because a lot of them are much smaller businesses and they don't necessarily have a legal team that's reviewing regulations in all the different states as it comes out, and an operations team of the scale we have, and figuring out how to procure PPE and all of this type of thing that we were able to do. And so we tried to share that knowledge in a way that now that we're kind of through that, we see a lot of our suppliers have come back and thanked us and specifically cited different things that we were able to share for information that made a meaningful difference on their ability to react and execute. So I think, in the beginning, you're just sort of trying to figure out, what do I need to get done? Who's going to do what? It's a little bit of like just a rapid sort of field operation. You just try to figure out what you need to do to keep moving. And then I think the communication, though, is really key. And that was also internal, communicating with everyone in the company so that everyone felt secure and safe and knew what was going on and felt like they weren't in the dark.
Right. Now, you talked about how important it is to have a great team. And it seems like you've consistently hired great people for your team. In fact, recently we had Laura Scott, who's a Tuck alum as well as a Wayfair alum, who's now COO of Takeoff Technologies, talk about some of the great things she and her company was doing. Give us a little insider into how Wayfair thinks about identifying, hiring, and retaining and keeping talent, and keeping connected to talent and helping them in their careers that might be outside of Wayfair.
Yeah, so we put a huge value on having an amazing team. And so what we do is we expend that effort on everything from whether it's recruiting, whether it's the learning and development once someone's at the company, and then it's participating broadly in the community. And what we find is that really talented folks, they want to work in an environment where they get to work with other really talented folks. And they want to be in that type of environment where they can learn a lot, where they can meet interesting people, where they can be very ambitious and go after kind of ambitious goals and actually achieve them and have the resources that allow them to succeed. And so the simple nature of the culture we have and the company and the opportunity we have, I think it's quite attractive to them once they understand that. And the fact that we then bet on our people because we put a ton of energy in getting the best people, then constraining them doesn't make any sense. You know, why would you put all this energy into getting them if you're then going to constrain them and not allow them to really, you know, be ambitious and go after really, you know, big goals and try to be successful. So I think the other thing they enjoy is how they're in a place with a lot of resources with other talented folks and actually have the ability to go after things. And they're entrusted with that autonomy and that authority. So that's kind of how we attract them and retain them. And then being a big participant in the community, we think helps us as well, because at no point will all the talent be at Wayfair. So broadly being a participant in the community makes the whole ecosystem stronger. And frankly, then selfishly for Wayfair, it also helps build up our employer brand so that folks know of Wayfair. And maybe now is not the time they want to be at Wayfair, but perhaps they will want to be in the future.
Right. I mean, it's interesting. You talk about the team, and you and Steve have been together over multiple companies for a long time. And it's interesting, sort of this partnership. Often you hear people talking about co-anything doesn't work very well. But you guys have been partners for a long time. How is that work? How have you been able to sort of work together, share responsibilities successfully over such a long time when you see other founding teams and founding partnerships have trouble with that?
Yeah, so Steve and I we both went to Cornell, and we're basically good friends, actually roommates for 4 years we were at Cornell, and we started our first company right out of college, right out of Cornell. And so we've been working together now for 25 years. I think the reason it's worked quite well is actually that while we really respect each other's opinion and judgment, the actual areas that we're drawn to and are interested in are actually quite different. And so it wasn't that we had to like sit down and discuss, okay, well, you need to do this, and okay, I need to do this. It's almost like we automatically were drawn to areas that are highly complementary. And I think one of the challenges in business partnerships is either that there isn't a real interest in each other's opinions, or there's an issue where there's sort of work that both folks want to do, and maybe there's work that no one wants to do, or so on and so forth. And that gets tough. And so I think there's an element where you do need to learn how to work together no matter who your business partner is. But if you have the nice kind of foundation and you share the same goals, I think it can obviously work out quite well, because any entrepreneurial journey is going to have kind of ups and downs and challenges. And it's I think in some ways it would be quite lonely if you didn't have someone to share that with.
So it's interesting because as you think about this, it probably would be hard for you to even think about a world in which you weren't working with Steve at this point, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. Now the company's just so much larger, and we have a senior team, of folks who run the whole business, and so I would say that the years that matter the most are almost the earliest years, because over time you end up with a broader team, but in the beginning you don't have a team, right? And so that's really the key part. But yes, at this point, yeah, I mean, that's been my, we absolutely have enjoyed working together.
Yeah. As we think about our students who are thinking about working for companies, they're evaluating companies, they're getting job offers, they're trying to think about what company or sectors to go into. What advice would you give them in thinking about what types of companies they should be attracted to? What type of industries should they be attracted to? What are the things that they should look at for their entry job into a sector or a company? What advice would you give some of our students?
Yeah, so I generally, couple pieces of advice. So one is, think about what you would enjoy doing, because it's very hard day in, day out to give something your all if you don't enjoy it. And there'll never be a job that you enjoy 100% of. So there's going to always be some parts that maybe are more fun than others. So you need to be aware of that, right? That's just reality. But make sure you're going to enjoy where you go, because giving it your all is critical to success. And doing just what you need to do, that's never been a recipe for great success, right? And so you always want to try to figure out how to do more than that. And then the second thing I encourage folks to do is go somewhere that's growing, because a company that's growing has a lot of opportunity. Opportunity constantly is being created. If you go to a company that's not really growing, and maybe they're growing, 2, 3, 4% a year, inflation kind of growth, the problem is it's a zero-sum game. And so the company's not necessarily hiring rapidly. There's not necessarily new opportunities being created. So your personal growth trajectory and your personal opportunity set will be just far lower. So even though sometimes growth may seem scary, or the company may be perhaps a little less, you may view it as less, from a kind of secure job security standpoint, less safe than perhaps a very large, more stable company. I just think that, early in your career, you should be very comfortable taking all kinds of risks, because the risks aren't very large. And the opportunity of learning is really what is going to set up your whole career trajectory over time.
Right. Let me flip it a little bit. So let's say, let's take you back in time, right? So we take you back in time where we both had probably a little bit more hair. And you were just starting, you were starting your career, you were coming out, you were thinking about starting a business. If you were doing that now, what type of business would you start? Where would you start it? Where would you look?
Well, so I tend to think that the disruption being created by the combination of the internet, so global network of all the devices, coupled with the advent of smartphones. And so you're carrying a very powerful computer around with you everywhere you go that has the ability to control all kinds of things, or give you access to all types of services and information, that we're still in the early journey of that. And so, because people say, oh, well, these companies have all been built. But yeah, I'm sure a lot of companies have been built. But if you look, for example, when we talk about e-commerce, the folks who are winning in auto, auto was, they're relatively much newer companies. And there's all types of industries that are slower to evolve. So whether it's things that are highly regulated, like financial services or healthcare, there's going to be change everywhere. And so I tend to think that there's still a huge amount of opportunity to be found when you just think about any product or service, and how do you just make the consumer's life, or the B2B case, the customer's life, easier for them to basically get things that they need to do done. So it doesn't even need to be innovative in that it's an offering that no one's ever bought before. Most of the largest businesses are offerings that basically folks have done before. They're just letting you do it in an easier, more convenient way. Google basically is replacing the public library and the yellow pages, and you could get information before, but it was nowhere near as convenient. And so, for home goods, for what we do, you could get these products before, but the amount of effort you would need to invest into getting a big selection, because you have to visit so many stores, and your ability to then compare these items and your ability to picture these items, it was just very difficult. So we're doing it in a better way. I think that can be true for almost any service or product that you consume or do. And there's no end, I think, to the opportunity right now, because this type of evolution happens over 50 years. And we're somewhere in the middle of that. That doesn't happen overnight.
Right. And that comes back to, there's always debate when you have investors, right? That there's discussion that sort of Wayfair's success is based on sort of COVID, and then it's going to flatten or go down dramatically once we're out of it. Others have argued that it's a sea change. As you think about Wayfair going forward, what's your argument for where you can see the continued growth of COVID, where this isn't a temporary shock or a temporary situation?
Well, to your earlier comment, we're 18 years old. We've been growing for 18 years. So, COVID's relatively new this year, right? And so you could say, oh, well, COVID's created a surge, and so perhaps the growth rate will drop down some. And sure, that's entirely possible. But then there's a lot of things we're doing that could just unlock more growth. And I mentioned the last 6-year CAGR has been 40%. So the way I look at it is, I think folks overly obsess about the growth rate. They think there's if you grow at 41%, you double in 2 years. If you grow at 32%, you double in 2.5 years. And if you grow at 26%, you double in 3 years. And so what's interesting is, power 2, right? 2, 4, 8. So, if you double 3 times in a row, you're 8 times as big. And in one case, it would take 6 years at 41%. And at 26%, it would take 9 years. Well, if you're going to be 8 times as big, what's the big difference between 6 and 9 years? There really isn't a big difference. And so I think folks take a focus on growth rates to basically come to the conclusion that you can't grow. And what they're really doing is they're arguing about how long it would take to grow to a certain size. And they sort of get themselves confused into thinking that that means that you're not going to grow. And I think the obsession with modeling out growth rates is a mistake, because when you're growing at these outsized rates, there's volatility in that growth rate, and trying to predict it, I think, ends up being a little bit of a fool's errand. And what you're better off doing is thinking about the long-term outcomes you can create. And that's where you see some of these companies have just gotten incredibly large. It's because of the power of compounding over a long period of time.
So there's that confidence. As we think about, one of the things that we talk about both with other executives and also in our classes is the changing nature of business and the influence of things that you can't control. So as you think about, doing business, how do you deal with sort of all the uncontrollables, whether there's suppliers that give poor quality items, influencers that influence what people buy. There's a building ecosystem around that often impacts any e-commerce internet business that you don't control. How are you learning, or how have you learned to handle that?
Well, I mean, I think there's an element where you're never going to control everything. And so what you want to do is you want to just basically try to make educated guesses and make a kind of, make sure you're only taking on reasonable amounts of risk. But I do think there's an element where you just need to assume things in the world will continue to change. And so no matter what decisions you make today, you should be willing to revisit them tomorrow with whatever you learn. And I think that mentality and that attitude serves you well. I think folks who like to be definitive and lock in a 5-year plan and not revisit it, I think that just the risk of, the odds of success and the risk you're taking on is very high. The odds of success go down dramatically, where compared to someone who's continually willing to evolve based on all new information they take in.
One of the things that you mentioned, and we're going to be going to Q&A in a couple of minutes, but one of the things that you mentioned was your emphasis on the quantitative approach to analyzing your business, to analyzing your customers. Sort of two things. Our students often ask, how quantitative do I have to be? So as you think about this, how is it important? They all ask questions like, do I need to learn how to code? Do I need to know higher order statistics? So the first part of the question is how much do our students need to know about this? And the second piece of it is, how far is that going? And so what is your use as a company for things like machine learning and artificial intelligence? And do you see that accelerating, flattening off? What's your use of those types of quantitative technologies?
I think technology is only becoming more and more important. And at this point, technology is becoming critical to virtually every business in the world, every industry in the world. Because, it's no longer just using a third-party product that can do X, Y. There's almost always some proprietary aspect to it in most companies that are really being ambitious. Machine learning and basically being able to take advantage of the data in a self-learning and continual learning way has been a big unlock for us, and we're aggressively expanding our use of it. And so what I would say is important, I think those are building software, designing software, data science. These are all incredibly growing fields. So for anyone who's interested in those, I would say absolutely the deeper you get in those, the more successful you'll be, whether or not it's that you're practicing that craft or you just use the knowledge you have of the craft in your other endeavors. If you are someone who knows you want to go down the business track, be a general manager, be a leader, making sure you understand at least how technology works is critically important, because you're going to have a hard time envisioning what's possible and then thinking about how one should invest and what one can unlock and what your strategy should be if you basically view technology as tools someone else will give you or tools someone else will figure out for you. I think it's actually an aspect of defining your business strategy. And so I think you don't necessarily need to know how to develop software, but having an appreciation of how that process works. And and what can be done, I think is really important. And so I've always encouraged folks, like, just, taking, kind of an introduction to computer science class is, it's, anyone can do that. And just the basic level of what you learn will be incredibly helpful, regardless of whether you ever even consider that as a career. And so I do think these types of technologies are very important.
Yeah. Good. So I'm gonna pause there, and I'm gonna open it up, Patrick, if you're there to come in, and to see if we have any questions, because I could keep asking you questions for the next hour. So, Patrick, are there any questions from the audience that you'd like to pose to Niraj?
Yeah, there are a couple questions that are around a similar theme regarding international expansion of your business and sort of how you prioritize markets, how you select which markets to go into first. And particularly the angle is also about emerging markets versus more developed markets, and sort of where you prioritize and what the trade-offs are.
Yeah, so I mentioned, today we're in the US and Canada in North America, and in Europe we're in the UK and Germany. And right now we've really constrained our focus to North America and Europe. And even within those, taking a very disciplined approach to not entering too many countries too quickly, because our belief is that you need to really play to become number one. And there's a lot you then need to do in order to get yourself on that trajectory. And to try to do too many things and spread yourself too thin, you could end up winning at nothing, which obviously would not be a great long-term outcome. And so that's the way we think about it. Now, that doesn't mean there are not other attractive markets in the world. There certainly are, but just what I just mentioned, Europe and North America is an $800 billion end market. And that's about 70% of the world's spend in these categories. And so we believe that trying to then compete somewhere that's very different, whether it be Japan or South Korea or China or India, these are some of the other markets that would be viewed as generally large and attractive, it would be a mistake. And a lot of those markets have domestic native companies who are winners. And so trying to go up against them could also be a challenge. And China in particular, it's very hard. I mean, the American internet companies don't have a great track record in China, frankly. So the way we think about it is, we defined a pretty big space, and we're far from doing everything we can do in that. So we're just going to stay with that focus.
Niraj, when you talk about the differences and the similarities, is it the product mix? Is it distribution? Is it regulation? What's the leverage points that make you say, oh, we can enter into this market versus this one's probably a little bit too difficult for us right now?
So the recipe is the same. So we know what we need to do around selection and merchandising and delivery and service and, et cetera. But there's a challenge with, if you enter a new geography, but perhaps you need a new language, perhaps there's new payment methods, perhaps there's new delivery providers, et cetera. And so what happens is there's a lot of work to be done. And basically that work never ends. And so the team that's working on doing this for Germany and the UK or for the US and Canada, it's not like they're going to stop doing that market and then do a new market. So it's an additive amount of work you need to do. And so there's just a pace at which you want to make sure that you're doing everything you can in the markets you're in to win. And you need to feel like you have the bandwidth and the resources to incrementally take on this additional work that, by the way, will never end either. And so you will keep expanding, but there's just a maximum rate at which you can do that while believing that you're doing everything you need to do for what you're already doing well and can expand. And I think folks sometimes have rose-colored glasses and kind of, the kid in the candy store analogy. Well, you can eat enough candy that can make you sick. And so you want to start off saying, well, I know I don't want to get sick. That would be an unwise use of resources to make myself sick. And so it's not that the issue isn't that I don't have the money. The issue is that, like, spending too much money, I'll actually get worse outcomes than spending a little less, because I got to make sure I can do everything very well. And so what's the upper limit? And then inside that envelope, what are the things then I can add in this year? What can I add in next year, et cetera?
So we have another question regarding sort of the competitive set in the US and thinking about Amazon and sort of their kind of position in the space, as well as other potential or existing growth kind of companies and the aggressive move that, for example, that Walmart is making. And so one where the online experience becomes very much a leader in the logistical capabilities, and the other where the footprint is physical and pretty widely dispersed across the country. How do you kind of think about combating what is potentially, two different two different competitors with different advantages compared to your business and today?
Yeah, so we actually think of ourselves having many competitors. So in other words, if you pick a category, if we were talking about lighting, we might say that Home Depot and Lowe's are the national competitors. And then there's, in every geography, there's a handful of local lighting showrooms that are not national companies, but if in every geography, there's a few different companies that compete with each other. And we're competing with all of those folks, as well as the online assortment that an Amazon, Walmart, Target, Home Depot, Lowe's would all have. And so rather than focus on, well, a competitor is doing this, we should do this, what we try to do is focus on what does the customer want? And how do we deliver the best experience for the customer, and then use our prowess at advertising and marketing to make sure that they know that we're claiming that we're a great solution for them for this category, lighting in this example, get them to come check us out, and then let them recognize what we're offering versus what whoever else they might consider is offering. And they'll then make a wise decision of where they want to go. And so while Walmart's obviously a very, very large company, I'd say their overlap with us is less than some others. But a Home Depot, Target, and Amazon, they're all competitors. Lowe's, Walmart, those would be the five that probably would be the biggest ones we compete with. And, everyone has a focus on what they're prioritizing. And I think a lot of those guys, for example, are prioritizing grocery, or Home Depot and Lowe's focus on the builder. And we're focusing on that consumer for home. And so you do things a little differently.
So there's another question regarding your opening of outlet stores or pop-up stores and the brick and mortar presence that you've been developing, and sort of how you think about the advantages that give you as primarily an e-commerce company. Certainly been a trend that we've seen across a number of direct-to-consumer brands, as well as, clearly Amazon has started to build, physical retail out as a part of its footprint too. Can you talk a little bit about that? That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, so we think physical stores, the reality is, I think people confuse two different things. The number of stores we have today, the US is off the charts with the square feet of retail space per person relative to even Western Europe, which is way up above Asia, right? And China in particular. So the US is definitely overstored, but people confuse that with saying, well, stores will go away. They're not going to go away, but let's just make it up. Maybe half of them will go away. But at some point, you'll reach a balance where there's a use case for stores, there's a use case for online. Different customers have different preferences. Not every use case is the same for every individual. And so for us, if we're going to have the leading platform for home goods in North America and in Europe, and we have distribution in the form of, we send people emails, we advertise on search, we have display ads, we send over 100 million pieces of direct mail a year, we have catalogs. Why would we not want to have stores? That's an other experience. We have it so you can call and talk to one of our 3,000 folks who can help you over the phone. You can email us. Well, why would we not want to interact with you in person in a store? So we're in the early days of figuring out, what does that mean? What is the store format that allows us to bring this promise to life? What exactly should we offer in the store, et cetera? So I wouldn't say we figured it out, but if you think of us as in an R&D phase for something we know makes sense as a piece of the puzzle, that's a fair way of summarizing where we are. And we'll figure it out over some period of time. And then, as we've done with everything else, once we figure it out, we'll start scaling it. And that'll play out over time as well. And so to me, it's a very logical evolution versus a sort of like no stores binary type thing. It's natural that it's part of the mix. And it'll take us a little while to figure out exactly what that means.
Great. There's another question around building versus buying technology and capabilities and sort of your approach to that. I think, one of the things that the question answer, posed also looks at, and something we've noticed in all our discussions with a lot of companies, there's also a proliferation of small to medium-sized technology companies offering very best-in-breed point solutions, and sort of how do you think about both the larger build versus buy, but also how do you balance small versus large, integrated versus very kind of best-in-breed software?
So in a lot of areas, we believe that the technology can give us a very substantial competitive advantage. And so it actually makes sense to build our own. So a lot of our core systems that hold our catalog, the systems that, you experience as a consumer on the website or the app, the supply chain systems, we've ended up building those. Now, what ends up happening is when you first start down a road, often it makes more sense to buy. So for example, our first warehouse management system was a software product we just licensed. But then as our warehouses and our logistics got more and more complex, trying to stay within the confines of the functionality they offer didn't make sense. So we've ended up building our own and migrating to the one we built. because it made sense. But then we have some large products, like for example, for payroll and HR administration, we use Workday. And it makes sense for us to license Workday. We will not get a competitive advantage of writing our own payroll processing software. There's no advantage there. There's a myriad of rules and tax rates and things you need to do. But frankly, we can buy a product and execute it as well as if we build it at a much higher cost. It would cost us to build it, and we would get no gain out of it, right? And so we're not going to even question, building that. So to me, it's not that you tend to do one or the other. It's like, what's the rule set on why you would build or why you would buy? And people like it to be a one-way answer. Oh, we build. Oh, we buy. And that's oversimplifying what's a complicated decision. In terms of the small products, so we've definitely noticed that. And the challenge with the small products, frankly, is a lot of them, in order for an enterprise software company to succeed, a lot of times they want, they still have a price tag they want because they sort of need it for their revenue model to work because the sales effort's still very high. And so a lot of these narrow products, they can be quite good, but they're still quite expensive. So I would say we use some of them, but the way we think about it is we don't have a bias of small versus big, but we do have a very keen eye on value for the money. And so the question is, that product, what value are we going to get? And a lot of times products will take claims to a lot of value, where to get all the value, you have to also do A, B, C, and D in addition. And so we try to be very honest about total costs, total benefits, and be pragmatic in what we do, and not sort of just keep buying expensive products willy-nilly. But we're a pretty large business. We have quite a few different products that we use for different things, but there's a process we go through with some rigor because it's very easy to let the software spend proliferate.
And how has that changed over time? So for example, you're founded, as we mentioned, 18 years ago, very different software environment than if you were starting the company today. Would you be looking to build more or leverage these solutions more heavily if you were starting today?
I think we'd have the same philosophy. And what happens when you're smaller is you end up buying more than you end up building, just because the value you can get out of it, you're constrained by so many other things. The building wouldn't unlock additional value. As you get bigger, there's a thing that you were buying and now you're just big enough that this use case it solves for is common enough and big enough that building it actually unlocks value. And so it's the same logic tree, but I think you typically start with buying and you migrate to building as it makes sense, as is, again, a very quantitative approach, right? We find that like when folks try to veer away from the quantitative and make more of an emotional argument, it's okay, let's look back to the quantitative. What is actually the math of it? And a lot of times the emotional argument is just because someone would prefer X versus Y versus it actually makes more sense.
Switching gears a little bit, there's a question about your kind of role as a corporation and how you think about sustainability and sort of what role that plays in your business, how that's changed over time.
Yeah, so it's interesting on sustainability, on DEI. There's some topics we've actually done a tremendous amount in, but I think we've not been as good as some other companies in publicly talking about it in order to get credit. So one of the things we're actually working on is, as we always are, how do we do more? But frankly, having an area of our website where we talk about the company itself. We think about the website as a shopping experience. The content areas where we talk about ourselves, we think we've underinvested in. As we've gotten to be bigger and we play a bigger role in society and we have more people who work for the company and who are hiring and more people in our ecosystem, we feel like making sure we're telling the story of what we're doing is important. We actually this summer did a greenhouse gas audit so we could more quantify actually what impact we have on the environment and to quantify the different efforts we have to mitigate that. So there's a fair amount we're doing. But I think that's been something we haven't been great about communicating about. And so we're going to tackle that too. Frankly, to try to get some credit as well with our constituents that we work with.
Yeah. So there's a question regarding sort of partnership as a platform versus sort of thinking of yourself as much more agnostic around some of the brands that come onto the platform and prioritizing certain brands versus others via more of a platform model. Can you talk a little bit about your approach to, you've mentioned, and I know from talking with other folks there that the branding inside the furniture industry in particular is not very prominent and front of mind from a vendor perspective. How do you think about sort of partnership models with companies, that you're partnering with at Wayfair? We
do think of ourselves as running an open platform. And so actually any supplier can sign up to be on the platform. They can, there's tools they can upload items, they can manage their business through the interfaces we have. The only requirements we have are around, there's certain requirements around legal requirements, there's certain requirements around accuracy of data, around operational fill rates, but there's no, like, we don't say you have to ship everything in 2 days. We say, tell us what your lead time is, and you need to be highly, fill rate needs to be very high at what you promised, and so we do operate with that mentality today, and we try to be a partner to these companies and share with them best practices, insights they may not have otherwise, data they don't have to help them be successful. And we found that really works well because we're trying to really aggregate the whole selection so the customer has the benefit of seeing everything that's available. And then we try to have tools for them and algorithms as well for them to help them find items that are of particular interest to them. And that's one of the things that's novel around home and fashion, which is everyone buys unique items, and people don't want to own the exact same items as each other. Like owning the same exact, shirt as your friend is not something you're coveting doing. Whereas buying the same television because you both figured out it was the best one in the market at a mid-price point right now is a positive sign. So it's our model is different, and having that selection is critical for it.
Niraj, we want to be conscious of your time, and we're sort of up on our time. But there's one last thing I want to ask, because many of our students want to be you. And so the question is, how can they become you? What advice would they give them to become you, to be CEO of a company with a $30 billion market cap?
Yeah, well, I'll answer that. And then unfortunately, I do need to run right after that. But what I will say is just remember when we started, it was just me and Steve. So, what we did do though, is we were willing to take a risk. So we had an idea we liked. We took a risk on it. And then what we also didn't do is once you have an opportunity and you could sell the business for $20 million, sell it for $50 million, sell it for $100 million. Well, if you think it can keep compounding, selling it at that point may be unwise if your goal is for it to be very large. Because the hardest part is actually getting the initial momentum. If it's something that can keep going, compounding that thing is actually, frankly, in some ways often easier than getting it going. So, you got to decide what you personally want. But if you want that, the key is to get started, take some risk, and then make sure you're operating in a big enough market that if you do it right, you can just keep going.
Well, thank you very much. We enjoyed giving your insights. It's great talking to you. We look forward to talking to you again soon and hearing more great things about Wayfair.
Take care.
We appreciate it. Thanks.
Thank you.
And thanks everyone for joining.